Hey everyone, welcome to my review of episode 1 of Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Alright, it's only been 2 weeks and we already have a new Marvel show, this time Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and it definitely did not disappoint. Anyone worried about a letdown doesn't need to worry. This show is going to have the same quality as the first one, which for me is a good thing because I really enjoyed WandaVision. But if you were underwhelmed by WandaVision or just want to stick with the movies, well, you're going to miss out on what I think is going to turn out to be a pretty good TV show. So right off the bat, I would say overall, I would give the episode a solid B. I thought it was a good start. Nothing too overwhelming, nothing unexpected. It was just a really good action show. Before I get into all the things I really enjoyed about the show, just a couple things that I was a little underwhelmed by. First of all, the effects and the action sequences were good, but they definitely weren't great. If you are comparing them to the MCU movies, you're going to be disappointed. If you're comparing them to an average broadcast television show, definitely way better than that. But comparing it to, say, Daredevil, or the other Netflix Marvel shows, is comparable. This was a lot more effects than those shows would use. Those shows were really more focused on, characters and action sequences. But in terms of the stunts and the action, I might even prefer some of those Marvel shows, especially Daredevil and the Punisher. So while the effects and the action were solid, it definitely wasn't as good as it could have been. But if your main complaint about the show is the effects, you just have to ask yourself, would you rather not have these shows at all? We're getting a lot of great television content. No, it's not going to be at the level of the MCU movies. The last movie we saw was Endgame. I guess technically Spider-Man Far From Home, but yeah, of course these shows are not going to be up to that quality. But I really enjoy the ambition, and they're pushing television, in new directions it's never been. So I'm digging that. Second, and I think a little bit more troubling for me, there's a lot of new characters introduced, and they were all fine. That's probably the best I can say about it. There's no glaring weaknesses, no terrible acting or anything, but there's nothing that stood out of the different characters introduced. I definitely felt like the story that was focused on Bucky and the date that he went on, that was nice. It was a little hokey, but this is a guy from the 1940s, so a little hokiness is okay, especially when you compare him to Steve Rogers. So that was nice, and I like those characters, but none of the villains really stood out. We obviously haven't gotten to any of the big bads. Maybe at the end, near the end of the episode, we did get a glimpse of, maybe one of the secondary villains, not obviously Baron Zemo or any other major villains that we're going to get, but it did seem like we saw someone with enhanced powers, and that was all right, but it certainly wasn't like, oh, that was so cool. And that to me is a little troubling, is that, you've spent a lot of time getting these shows ready, a lot of resources, a lot of money, obviously, but you didn't take the time to come up with really compelling characters, supporting characters, and often in the MCU movies, it's those secondary characters that stand out the most. And for WandaVision, we at least had Agatha, who was a huge breakout character, but all the other secondary characters that really, popped in WandaVision, they're all people that we've seen before. And I would like to see some of these shows introduce us to fan favorites, and I don't feel like that's happened yet. Give it time, obviously. Maybe some of these secondary characters are going to develop and we're going to really appreciate them, but Sam's nephews, those kids, they could have been any two random kid actors. They were barely on screen. It's like, okay, we have to reserve judgment, but so far in that department, underwhelming. One last thing I want to call out, the therapist scene with Bucky. I mean, really? It's just like we've seen this type of scenario where our hero is being forced into therapy. And the one nice twist on this is that it seemed like he was taking it more seriously than she was. That, like, maybe they're kind of trying to paint her as a bad therapist, which is at least a twist, but just the whole dynamic is just pretty tired at this point. And unless you're really going to take it in an interesting direction, I mean, The Sopranos have already done it, right? So I was definitely not impressed with that part. And yeah, if they keep up with that, I really hope they do something cool with it, because otherwise it's just, again, underwhelming. But there were a lot of things I really did like. I always start with the negatives to get those out of the way. I don't want you to think that I didn't enjoy the show. I really did. A lot of great action. What I really dug was the focus on character, and I think that's the whole reason why these shows are so fantastic in terms of at least an idea, is they have the potential to really focus in on these characters that we haven't gotten to focus on in the movies because there's so much happening and you only have 2 hour windows. And so, especially with Bucky, to get that in-depth look at where he's at, and we understand the journey he's been on, but now to see him really wrestle with that, that's fantastic. To get more depth to Sam's character, before he was just the sidekick in some of the Captain America movies, and now to see him get to have a show focused on him, that's fantastic. And so while, yes, some of these threads are not super compelling yet, but just taking the time to develop these characters, I love it, and I hope we get more of it. Obviously, we will. But I think what I most loved about episode 1 can best be summarized by the very end of the episode, when we get introduced to this new Captain America, and it's not Sam and it's not Bucky, it's just this random white dude. And I think that's great, and I think that is why this show is going to be fantastic. I love that they are apparently going to be focusing in on some really relevant issues to our country right now, in terms of, what does America stand for, and who does America represent, and who deserves not the right word, but who gets to call themselves a patriot. I think after the year 2020 that we just went through, with all of the focus on social justice and trying to create more diversity in our country and trying to accept, immigration and race, and look, hopefully trying to move beyond that, but by first really addressing it. With all of that going on in our country, if you have a show, it's not called Captain America, but it's about, the two people closest to Captain America. One of them, was given the shield by Captain America. The colors of the show, red, white, and blue. This is obviously a show about our country, and if you didn't address things like race in this country, it would have just felt it wouldn't have felt real. And so I'm really happy that they're going to deal with that. And anyone that is unhappy and doesn't think that these movies should focus on these issues, well, then you're not really a Marvel fan, because that is always what Marvel has stood for. Marvel has always been focused on these issues, whether it's race or sexuality, or just, what it means to fit in, anti-Semitism. These are things that Marvel has been dealing with since, the beginnings of the X-Men. That's the whole point of the X-Men, right? And so, anyone that is complaining doesn't understand what Marvel is, and doesn't really understand what our country should be about and what it's meant to represent. So I think the dynamic that they have set up, that they have, a black hero that was picked by the Captain America, the hero of all of the phase 1, 2, and 3 of the MCU, the shining light of our country, has picked Sam Wilson to be the next Captain America, and has said, you deserve it. And well, he feels like maybe he can't live up to that, But when it's taken away from him and given to someone else, that what has this random person done to deserve it? I think that you've created a really interesting dynamic for the show, and so I'm really excited to see where this is going to go. And I just would like to point out just one comparison to WandaVision. What I felt was the weakest part of WandaVision was acting director Hayward. He was such a blah villain, just nothing, interesting or unique about him. It could have been any random, bureaucratic FBI agent in any movie or TV show that we've ever seen over the last 50 years that is, on the side against the hero. We've seen it so many times before, and acting director Hayward brought nothing new. And for me, that was the worst part of the show. And so what I really love about what they've set up in Falcon and Winter Soldier is they've, rather than focus this, on some kind of, secondary villain that is meant to, be in the way of our heroes, but is just, super generic, rather than do that like they did in WandaVision, they realized that the real interesting part isn't the individual that is standing in Sam's way, but it is the institution and the idea that is standing in his way. And so just the idea that they have chosen to take the shield away from him, even though he voluntarily gave it, they are like, you did the right thing. And he thought it was going to be in a museum. And instead they took the shield and they gave it to a new, almost certainly undeserving Captain America who just happens to be white. That idea, and rather than embody that in some character that could never really, live up to that idea, they've just let the idea be what it is, and just, it is acted out through some random bureaucrats that doesn't matter who they are. They're just, some character actors that they got to fill these roles. It's just that institution that is standing against Sam. That's the interesting part. And I think if WandaVision had realized that and had done something similar, I'm just spitballing here, but instead of having acting director Hayward be a friend of Monica and her mother, and there being that kind of, not very interesting dynamic between them, and then he turns out to be a jerk, but he is the one, all of the jerkiness goes through him. Instead, if they had focused on what was interesting, which was, well, the government thinks that Vision is property and Vision belongs to them, and you don't put a face to it and you don't make it be just some super mega jerk, but just that idea. And if you have Monica who gets told by a random person, hey, you're back, but you can't just go back to where you were. Things are different now. And we'll find a place, and it's just a random bureaucrat. And then Darcy and Jimmy get brought in, and there's no one in charge. They're just being directed by some subordinates, and so all of this action's going on around them, and just these three kind of find each other amidst this huge bureaucracy that's standing in the way of Wanda. And so they, instead of it having to be like this stupid villain, it's just like the idea that, hey, Wanda's doing something bad. The government has to stand in her way. The government's not prepared to deal with her as an individual because the government is the government. And so it takes these three individuals finding each other, banding together, trying to do what is right against the system. I think that would have been a lot more interesting. Anyway, sorry, that wasn't really a rant. That was just a, a rabbit hole that I just went down. But it's just one idea of what WandaVision could have done to fix its biggest weakness, and what I think Falcon and Winter Soldier has successfully, hopefully, is doing. That's going to be the best part of this show, or one of the best parts. So that's all to say. I'm really excited to see what comes next. My only prediction for episode 2 is I am assuming that we're going to get to finally see Baron Zemo. Maybe that's going to be how they end episode 2. That's right at the end of the first act, if we're thinking of all 6 episodes as a one long movie. Other than that, I just think we're going to get more action and more character development, and I'm really excited for it. So that's it for my review of episode 1. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed it and I didn't, ramble on too long, please like and subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you guys next time.